So this was just one of the many books that were written at that time that were full of excitement about the radical new world before us. And I just wrote down some of the kinds of claims that the contributors wrote, which could not really be further away from the ambitions of those who seek to test whether using technology enhances GPA. And I was entranced by this, I have to say. Technology here was being argued that it could liberate teachers and pupils from the rigid hierarchies which are locked into their desks and assessment straitjackets. It could mobilise multiple activities as mediators of learning, not only reading and writing, but also creating, designing, performing, searching, and playing. And it could rethink the role of the learner in flexible, negotiable terms precisely because knowledge itself is fluid and open to interpretation. Sherry Turkle described this shift as profound, from a culture of calculation, where, she says, the modernist computational aesthetic promised to explain and unpack, to reduce and clarify, to a culture of simulation, where what is valued is the tinkering and experimentation at the interface, getting the lay of the land, rather than figuring out the hierarchy of the underlying structure and rules. 10 years on from these visionary predictions, some change is evident, though it remains piecemeal, it remains something hard for us to identify. But I think we all have stories like this one from Jackie Marsh, a story from a teacher she interviewed who had a young boy who engaged with a media literacy project at school, and as she said, really got into it, came alive, suddenly for the first time was a little boy who had something to say to everybody. As she said, not only does immediate technology motivate a previously disaffected child, but it enables him to find a voice and communicate effectively in that class for the first time. Henry Jenkins calls these the soft skills, or new literacies required by convergence culture, and he maps a refreshingly celebratory vision of children's creativity, thoughtfulness, and desire to learn anywhere, anytime. I'm sure you've all seen his list of soft skills, so I won't read them out, but they are, if we're looking for indicators, if we're looking for things to identify within media literacy enterprise, as I've heard a lot the last few days, some of these soft skills are a good place to start. So Jenkins argues that these soft skills can be positively supported through information and communication technologies if only schools would move beyond the individualistic skill and drill learning, the hierarchical teacher-pupil relation, and its narrowly instrumental specification of educational outcomes. Kerstin Grotner and her colleagues provide another case study, a study of a Danish animation project that deliberately broke with the school routine and the teacher-pupil hierarchies to enable pupils to co-design a digital animation over 2 weeks. They stopped the school for 2 weeks and they just all worked on this. And the researchers observed how pupils' decision-making, their design, construction, implementation, all emerged from profoundly social, playful peer interaction. So she argued learning is social rather than purely individual and is positively enabled by discussion, negotiation, imagination, and conflict resolution. In that project, again, there were the positive outcomes. Pupils learned both about software, media production, and team working. They gained the media literacy skills required to analyse and critique the multiplicity of representational forms and rhetorics that surround them in their daily life. And so peer culture was harnessed to deliver learning outcomes valued by teachers, children, and probably future employers. But some still are sounding that note of caution. Rebecca Willett describes observing a small group of 10 boys aged 9 to 13 in a Saturday morning workshop on computer game production. They were learning to use Photoshop and Flash animation. As she notes, it was difficult in practice to make sure that the children learned in the sequence steps of the task required, especially when they were learning to use complex professional software. So just as Ellen Saiter also noticed in her observations, when you really watch how this unfolds in practice, it was difficult to ensure that the teacher support was there at the right time, however much we might talk about just-in-time learning. And Rebecca Willett found also that boys were very quickly disillusioned because of their expectations of what a professional computer game was going to look like. Indeed, after reading her account of this rather kind of chaotic setting, we had some sympathy for that traditional vision of an orderly classroom, attentive children, and an authoritative teacher. So do these accounts undermine the demand for change? It seems that the optimistic signs in the work of some of the projects that I've mentioned derive from the ways in which technology affords intrinsically motivating opportunities for peer collaboration and social learning. And the more pessimistic signs seem to be associated with uses of technology to support what Justine Cassell calls the pedagogic relation between the expert and the novice, in other words, teaching led by teachers. So technology may enhance children's learning more in a heterarchical than a hierarchical context. And so, as we know, what matters is less the technology than how it's used. I remain enthusiastic about the excitement of new initiatives to transform the learning process. But if I turn the same critical gaze on these initiatives as I have on traditional attempts to enhance test scores, I have to acknowledge that just as there's a lack of convincing evidence that our information and communication technologies support traditional learning outcomes, so too is the jury out on the claim that these technologies can enable new and creative forms of learning. To address this situation, we need, and we still don't have, I think, a clear and shared conceptual vocabulary to talk about learning processes. Very pragmatically, we need funding for some large-scale empirical evaluations. We need new thinking as regards assessment, and I've been encouraged to hear lots of that thinking going on in this conference, but without turning soft skills into a new and burdensome set of targets. I don't know if you have rampant target culture here, but as soon as educators get hold of targets, it's no longer empowering. And most importantly, I think we need to decide how radical we really want to be in redesigning the power relation between teachers and pupils and the permeability of learning spaces from classroom to home and community. So I see us oscillating between these kinds of oppositions, and it's not so clear. You know, here's the romantic side, but it's unresourced. And the formal, hierarchical, traditional conceptions of what technologies could do in the classroom have the infrastructural support of the institution and the funding support that I started out by noting. So while we continue these debates, and we can go round and round, and we do, children are having some confusing and contradictory experiences, which certainly don't always match up to the ideals of educators on either side. On the one hand, we can see that in many ways they have moved away from books. Many children talk about books as boring, and the internet is the first place they turn when they want to know anything. But in practice, even the internet is not necessarily motivating. Listen to Angie, aged 9. This is what she says, and ask if her talk about computers is really so different from what previous generations said about books. It's just the way she says it. You have to hear it with a British accent. Yeah, it's IT, that's what it's called, and you go and you have about 10 computers in a big room. That's boring, she says. Here's some teenagers similarly giving us the sense that, you know, the internet is not changing that much. Yes, it helps you with some school subjects. There's some that it's good for, other things it's not good for, like English and maths, which are kind of important. To really understand people of our age group, we don't really use the internet to do like search most of the time. We're not quite getting their experience. Moreover, for books, the pedagogy was well established, even if it alienated many, as it did. But for the internet, supposedly more inclusive, more motivating, especially for the previously excluded, the pedagogy is really uncertain. Teachers are used to guiding children in the acquisition of print literacy, not just learning to read, but also learning to use dictionaries and encyclopedias, to search for specialist resources in libraries, to evaluate alternative sources, to determine authorial sources and critique complex texts.